It is our distinct pleasure today to have as our guest speaker Professor Thomas Belt, who has recently retired from Western Carolina University, where he was the Cherokee Language Program Coordinator. While he was at Western, he worked to create a state-of-the-art Cherokee language program at the university level. He's a citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. He's fluent in Cherokee, and he works closely with speakers from the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians to produce culturally based Cherokee language learning material. And the title of his talk today is Endangered Language, Cultural Crisis. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Belt.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. And I want to thank everyone who's involved in this program and stuff, and in particular the Mellon Sawyer Speakers Series for inviting me to be a part of this and to present what I know this afternoon. So with that being said, then I of course want to begin by acknowledging right off the bat to you that this particular topic of endangered languages and what it means to indigenous groups can't really be covered in all aspects in an hour's time, and it certainly can't be covered, I would say, in a week or even a year or an extended period. This is a very complex issue facing indigenous people in this country, because it involves not only just their language, it involves what we're talking about here. It also involves the continuation and the stability of of the cultures that we have. But first of all, to add to that, it's because that the importance of the depth of the language is historically layered. It's layered in the politics of colonialism and ethnocentrism that goes back for a long time, and all of the different facets of how that came about. I want to read to you all a quote, and that quote is, "Language has always been the perfect instrument of empire." This was a quote from by Antonio de Nebrija, who was the Bishop of Avila, Spain, in a publication of a thing that he wrote called "The Grammar of the Castilian Language," and he dedicated that work to Queen Isabella of Spain, and that statement was written down then and presented to Queen Isabella in actually, ironically, in 1492. This statement in this publication was actually the seed of that colonialism for Spain that was planted for the New World. And it began then for us here. So the depth of how far that goes back and how it was done in all of its many facets covers the actual, that goes back to the time of the arrival of Christopher Columbus. American expansionism, lightly put, continued this policy of ethnocentric, or what we would call linguistic imperialism, all the way in the 1950s through its policies with the boarding school system, and by espousing English language instruction as it applied to Native Americans in those boarding schools that were built by the churches and also by the United States government, was a means to better their economic condition, to solve their social ills. And it really meant that they could do this by assimilating. And to assimilate properly and to assimilate effectively, then you would have to speak the English language. It was imperative that be taught. It was imperative that the aspects of native culture and native thought were actually driven out of the students, and goes back even to the founder of the Carlisle Institute, a very famous boarding school that was started by, I think his name was Richard Pratt, who had been a soldier during the Civil War, started or the Spanish-American War. But he started, he headed the Carlisle Institute, a boarding school for Native Americans nationwide. And one of the statements that he made, of course, that everyone knows, is that his axiom for how to educate and how to make Indians become a part of the American system was to quote, kill the Indian and save the man. It kind of gives us an idea of how deep and how layered and how old this process is of imperial linguistics, of the way in which this country, through its policies and its politics, has aided in the dissolution of Native American languages. I think we have, as stated, about 530, 540 Native tribes left. And out of those, there are essentially few speakers. As is with the Eastern Band here, there are less than 200 speakers. Dr. Fry and I were talking a few minutes ago, and this past week, the last monolingual speaker of the Eastern dialect passed away. Monolingualism in our tribes has always been a choice. It wasn't a necessity, but it certainly was a choice, and there were many, many people who were monolingual, who could only speak Cherokee. And the same was for the population of Cherokees in northeastern Oklahoma, which is the other branch of the Cherokee tribe. And out of the they officially recognized 200 to 300 members of their tribe, not enrolled members, but members of their tribe. But the actual count of speakers, I think, is somewhere around 2,000. We really don't have an exact figure on those things. We can only estimate, because no one has actually gone around and identified each and every speaker and talked to them. And there is no grading system. There is no rating system as to who we would consider fluent or medium range or just conversational. But probably less than 200, less than 175 in the Eastern Band, probably less than 2,000, 2,000 to 3,000 possibly in northeastern Oklahoma, as compared to 300,000 people who recognize themselves and who identify as Cherokees. And out of the near 17,000, 16,000 Eastern Band members, there's less than 175 speakers left. And so we have gotten to that very, to that extremely critical point in the existence of our language. through all of the effects that have happened over these uh, many years. And so uh, that in what I've just talked about is in fact a very short summary uh, about how things go. As I said, to truly discuss these things, we'd have to go into every aspect, every tribe, and everything that happened to them, politically, educationally, socially. We would have to talk about every one of those things and how it affected the outcome and the status of their languages in each tribe. And those stories are just go beyond imagination. There are lots of documentaries that are being made about this, and stories, and people are just now becoming aware of how important that this issue is. Cherokee, what we call Cherokee, is actually as we know it, has in the best of estimations by anthropologists and even archaeologists as to when Cherokee people were recognized as having as being in the area of what we call Southern Appalachia, and actually all the way up to the Middle Alleghenies. Goes back about 3 millennia, about 3,000 years, at least 3,000 years. Now, in our own consideration and in our own stories, we say that we've always been here. And the fact of the matter is that hasn't been explored or researched to confirm that there were actual quote unquote Cherokee people here. But the fact that there were people here going back 15,000 years has been validated. We were part of that. So I think we can legitimately say that we've been here that long. We've been here at least since the last ice age, since the receding of the last ice age. This language that we speak is confined to that. This language, that is the Cherokee language, is confined to that one linguistic stock that is called Iroquois. And there are several tribes and several groups who speak the Iroquois, who are part of that Iroquois family, Iroquois language family. For the most part, most of them are in New York State now, and so there's long been a rivalry among Cherokees and the Iroquois people as to whether or not they originated here or we originated up there. But essentially, that issue really isn't an important one. It's only important that we do know that we are, in fact, relatives, that we are kinfolks. And this then begins the establishing of something that I wanted to talk about in reference to the aspect of language representing our culture, as well as other indigenous groups. Language is if we have been here for, by modern science reckoning, for at least 3,000 years, in these mountains that we lived in for that long period of time, it means that encoded in our language was an understanding and a description of the biological environment that surrounded us, as well as our concept of astronomy, as well as an intrinsic understanding of the physical and mental aspects of health among our own people. All of these kinds of things that we consider disciplines now, uh, um, um, astronomy, physics, biology, and health, all of these things were practiced and were understood by our people for that long period of time also. And the only way that we could practice that and understand that was in the way in which all people do on the face of the earth, is by expressing that in language, in sound. And this language then is the recorded or the volume of the experience of our people and our culture over that long, long period of time. It is, in fact, a scientific fact. We are now beginning to, the scientific community is now beginning to recognize the importance of that kind of knowledge, and it's been titled traditional ecological knowledge, if we're talking about biology and environmental studies. The knowledge of plants, the knowledge of all life in these mountains, of every form of life, flora and fauna, is encoded in the way in which we speak. It is a part of how we understand how that works. I want to speak for a little bit, and I want to point out, I can give you some examples, but first, could we go to a slide, let's go to slide 2 real quick. And bring that up. Okay, I want to make these points then, is that the Cherokee language then is a historical indigenous language, which we stated. It's an Iroquoian language. It is also a polysynthetic language. It is also a written language, and therefore then it is a written language, and at this particular point it is an endangered language. And we could move on to slide 3 then. It's been noted that, let's see if I can get this out of the way so that I can read it. Okay. I want to read this to you real quickly. I know you can read it too, but our intellect imposes its laws on nature. If you subscribe to this Kantian philosophical position, then you see each language as a theory of the world. Cherokee is a theory of the world. The Cherokee people, through their language, have developed a singularly important worldview that should not be discarded lightly. Okay, we can get off the slide if you want to now. This way of looking at the world then indicates that the way we only, that the linguistic adage of language is simply the way in which we interpret the world. It is the way in which we interpret the world. With that being said, then there are many, many kinds of languages. The language of that we understand now to be of flora and fauna. 400 years ago, we told people, not just Cherokees, but other tribes also, told the importance of trees and plant life being important in how we respected their lives and did things in order to keep that respect going, and did things in a cultural manner, because that is the correct way of doing it, because there are consequences for not doing it. And recently biologists have begun to understand, or have begun to believe that, or have found out that it's very possible that trees have memory. We said this 500 years ago. It indicates that we were aware of that kind of biology long before we were given credit for understanding that. It is, it's important to note that our biology, our health field, our science was regulated to mythology, to superstition, and to quaint stories dreamed up by a post-Stone Age people to try and explain something that they didn't understand by making up stories about it. When in fact, these were not stories like that. They were not mythology. They were not superstition. They were actually based on common science, on hard science. This is the way the world works. This is what happens, and this is why we lived here. A colleague of mine, Dr. Tom Hadley, who now resides in Asheville, North Carolina, who was once the distinguished Sequoia professor at Western Carolina University, in talking to a group of people one time back in those days, said that when Europeans first came to these mountains, when they first began to enter the Southern Appalachian Range and the Blue Ridge and the Alleghenies, it's documented that such statements were made that this was a virgin forest. It was pristine in that it was untouched except by the hand of God. And what they were really looking at, he said, was a form of agriculture that they simply could not wrap their minds around. These mountains and its life had been stewarded and cared for, and in a kind of a way, watched over and manicured for thousands of years. And it looked that way because it was cared for and maintained at the apex of how a biological system works. They knew every plant in these mountains. They had a name for every plant that grows in these mountains. And they not only had a name for it, but they knew its function, whether it was for nutrition or whether it was for medicinal purposes or for the many other aspects that any kind of life has. They knew all of those. And this was garnered through scientific research, and what we can consider, we can apply the same way in which we come up with hard science now to how that information came about. You really can't live in a place for 9,000 years and not know your own front yard. And these mountains and this land was our front yard, but it was also our backyard, and it was our neighborhood. It was the place where we lived along with everything else. And in order to be sustainable, in order to exist, in order to continue, the most feasible way to do that was researched and was brought about. And that's how we understood how to live here, and we did very well. We did very well for that time period. Without that understanding, then something is lost in the process of humankind. The first thing that goes away is your connection to where you live, your connection to the very environment environment that you originate from, and the very environment that you live from, the one that nourishes you, that keeps you alive. And it turns to be something, and without that, then everything out there becomes a threat, and is a threat because you don't understand it, because you don't know how it works. And such has been then the way that all of the landscape of this country and the entire area of North America has become and has been treated for the last 400 years. That lack of understanding of how that works is just now being realized and is just now being studied through the acceptance of such concepts as traditional ecological knowledge. This past week, the governor of California issued a proclamation that indigenous tribes in the state of California are going to be partners in any further research projects and any more efforts or programs to deal with the environment in the state of California, that the tribes in those areas are going to be called in as partners to to assist them in trying to understand just how this works there. I think they're learning their lesson from the recent forest fires that have gone on there, and they are giving precedence over their own land. At the same time, some 2,000 miles east in the state of Oklahoma, the state of Oklahoma just stripped the tribes, the 35 some odd tribes, 36 tribes, that clearly recognized tribes that live in Oklahoma, just stripped them of their EPA protection over their own lands. That they no longer have control over what might be decided for the best use of the minerals and the water on their own lands. This misunderstanding of that concept of environmentalism is still going on. It still exists. And the issue then that I'm speaking to this afternoon is how much we could learn, or how much we could, as very possibly the governor of the state of California is finding out, is how much we can learn from knowledge that has already been accumulated over thousands of years. We may be able to save some things. We may be able to turn that corner. We may be able to make things better if we listen to scientific fact that's been garnered over thousands of years. And the only way that we can access that information and that understanding is through the language. It's very difficult to, in some cases, as is with us in our language, it's very difficult to translate those things. And it's very difficult in any language to get the same aspects of what is said in one language over to another language. It just doesn't work that way. It takes a long time and a long process to begin to understand that. And I wanted to give you some examples of that this afternoon when we're talking about health. For example, we are now beginning to understand the importance of language use in such areas as treatment programs for drug abuse, for alcoholism, and also for just simple mental health, for counseling, for all of those things, for all of those problems that are plaguing the indigenous community and seem to be growing. Those who are clinicians and caregivers are beginning to understand that maybe we should do treatment using the language of the people who live there. Maybe we should begin to listen to what these words mean, because these words have deeper meaning. And I want to give you an example. In our language, when a person is feeling bad, what we would say, they're feeling down, they're feeling frustrated, they are at their wits' end, they're just frustrated, confused, and are depressed. When they have that, and we deal with them in the mental health field, there are many, and I am not a mental health expert. I am not a counselor, but I did work in a treatment center for about 7 years, but I was just an assistant counselor. But what I learned there was how things are done, and how things are. It was a treatment center for Native youth, and how they did the treatment center. I found out later on in visiting another treatment center in Asheville, North Carolina, that dealt with juveniles also, is that this essentially, the way that they were doing things at the treatment center that I worked was really no different from what they were doing there. It was going about it in the same way. you have to take into consideration the cultural differences of people. And in order to do that, I will restate the fact that you have to understand what they're saying and you have to understand how they look at the world. The word for being depressed in our language and feeling bad about that is a term that we use, and it sounds this way. This is the word. We would say eskan uyelai. Uyelai means they think that way or they feel that way. And eska means, we take it in this day and time to denote depression or sadness. But that word eska actually means back toward yourself. In other words, to throw something to me, I would say de jabdu gan, throw it to me. So if we were out on a park or we were in some recreational area and you were walking along by where we were playing ball and you found a ball there and you yelled out, who wants this ball? I might yell back at you if we were Cherokee speakers. I would say, eskan, dejadu gan. Eskan means back towards me. Dejadu gan means to throw it. Eskan, in all of its aspects, the word by itself just simply means back towards me. So when we say eska udan tan, when they feel that way, what we call depressed or sad, what we're really saying in Cherokee is that they are thinking back towards themselves. They're only thinking back towards themselves. Eskan. We know that the physiological structure of human beings is that our eyes are in the front of our face. It's not at the side. It's not in back. Our eyes are not there. They're meant to look forward and they're meant to look outward. We're not capable of turning our eyes inward and looking inside of ourselves because there's nothing there to see except more flesh. It's anomalous. The idea of thinking back toward yourself is a mental health anomaly. It goes against that way in which we have always considered the way in which you look at life and the way in which you live, by looking forward. It's the only way that you can see things. It's the only thing that you can see what is in your way. It's the only way you can see where you're at and how to get to where you're going and who you're talking to. You have to look outward. And to think back toward yourself then destroys in your thought patterns, destroys the existence of anything that is out there, and you're only thinking about yourself. And as I said, this is an anomalous concept. And the way in which we dealt with mental health was always through traditional caregivers, those speakers who have been termed healers or medicine people, used these words in their speaking with a person who came to them with those problems in order to situate them and make them realize where they are at because they've lost that sense of self and they've lost that sense of that kind of purpose. They dealt with this initially in a way of making them realize, for example, the first thing that a native healer in our tribe, the first thing that would be said to a person who came to them for help would be, actually the person that was seeking the problem didn't have to say the first thing. It was the healer who said the first thing, and his words were, or her words were always, what is happening in your and my world? And they would be said this, and Dr. Fry will understand this. They would say, Gedo nigasti ha. Ine ha. Ine ha means you and I. yours and my life. What is happening in yours and my life? Not what's happening in your life or what's going on with you, but what's happening in our world. And they would begin to, and then that's when they would begin to open up and say, well, this is going wrong, and I see this going wrong, and I can't do this and this and this. And then each of those problems then was looked at from the idea of how one approaches and how one begins to take steps to remedy those kinds of things in the way that you feel by dealing with them. So that a person was encouraged to begin to participate and begin to facilitate and function and re-enter the world as it really exists. In other words, to become a part of the world again, to reconnect not only with oneself, but the way in which you reconnect with yourself in a logical way was to reconnect with everything around you. No different than how one begins to become more comfortable in their own home, more comfortable around their own family, to begin to absorb that and to reconnect with that. You begin the process of healing. And all of the other things that they knew then on pharmaceuticals and precise nature of those kinds of things that they had to do were all, in fact, individualized for each and every person. Much had to be taken into consideration on how you treat somebody. You had to take into consideration, for example, where they had been in recent days, in recent months, almost to the point of who they had encountered. All of these things were discussed: who they'd talked to, who they'd seen, what they've done, what they ate. All of these kinds of things, where they drank water, where all of the things that they were supposed to do in their lives, they would recalculate those things and go back over those things in order to find the exact way in which to deal with this kind of anomaly. The only way that you can do that is to understand those terms for not only what that person feels, but the world they live in. And what I wanted to point out was that in the way in which mental health, just mental health alone, is prescribed and offered, doesn't even begin to cover any of those considerations. We just consider the individual, and we're beginning to understand a little bit about what they might have gone through, what might have caused this. But we're still focusing on certain kinds of things and not focusing on the complete picture or the all of the aspects of that person's life. That was true healing. That was true caregiving. That was true health, was to bring them back into it. And so that is what language did and what language provides us for. And if then you expand that into how we deal with animals, how we deal with plants, how we deal with the very nature we live in and how we live in that, there's an immense amount of wisdom and an immense amount of knowledge that can't even begin to be calculated or categorized in this day and time, because you have to know the language first. That is what is lost in the process of losing a language. It's not that you're just losing a code that everybody else has for things. It's not apples for apples and oranges for oranges. It's a whole different kind of concept. It's a different way of looking at the world. And it has history, it has validation, it has scientific merit. And to disavow or to let that kind of wisdom go away and become extinguished is almost a crime against humanity. We are throwing away our own knowledge. We are disregarding our own wisdom. Wisdom has been garnered and practiced for thousands of years, encoded in that language. And that is why languages have to be saved, because essentially, when you save that language, you are saving the people who speak that language. We are not, as was brought up at the early part of the last century by a woman, by a Lakota woman who actually taught at Carlisle Institute, one Zikala C, I think was her name. She wrote and worked very hard on trying to get the government and other agencies to understand the damage that those schools were doing to people by taking away, by enforcing English language use in the way in which they were educating them, because they were only educating them for vocational purposes also. And she felt and knew that they were capable of learning higher academics, and that the people were also unaware of what kind of lasting damage that they were doing to Native students who went to these schools, the kind of damage psychologically and emotionally that would stick with them for the rest of their lives and very possibly passed on to the next generation. She understood this at the beginning of the last century in the 1900s and wrote about it and campaigned for a better way to do that. That's amazing to me that went on, and very little is known about her. And I would assume that it's because she had two strikes against her. One, she was Native American, and secondly, she was a woman. And they just didn't take those things into consideration in those days as something that was viable and meaningful, at least not in academics. So we are at the point of knowing that we have, as I said at the very beginning, a multi-layered configuration and a very complicated way of looking at how all these came about. But essentially at the core of it is a form of ethnocentrism and a form of linguistic imperialism. You enforce these values in order to change them into something else. And in the process of trying to change them into something else and destroying that language, you also destroy those people. There's a story, there's a saying among Native people that says, in recent times, it says, when cats begin to bark, they're no longer cats. If they can only bark. They're speaking and using a method of communication that doesn't fit what they are. That doesn't fit all of the natural instincts of them. They're having to use a different language among themselves that doesn't do that. It's the way in which dogs do things. And the sad thing about it is that, and the reason why they are no longer cats is that maybe they're biologically always cats, but the language that they use, using that language isn't going to be accepted by the ones who actually speak that language. Dogs will not accept them as cats. And they can't speak to other cats who don't bark, so they cease becoming cats too. In other words, they become something else. They become something else. They're not dogs, they're not cats, so they have to find a way to become something else. And that is the situation that indigenous people in this country have faced and are still facing, I believe, without the use of their languages, that we lose who we are. We lose our identity. We lose our place in the world. This is not to say that monolingualism is the way in which we preserve cultures. It is incongruous and erroneous to think that Native tribes in the southeastern part of this country were monolingual. They were in fact multilingual. They spoke many languages. Their main language was their own, but they spoke other languages in order to facilitate a way of staying alive and a way of working with other people. And we did this for thousands of years. Multilingualism was considered an important factor in the way in our governance and in our culture. We had to know what the other people around us were saying in order to know how to deal with the problems that might arise. And in fact, may be able to help them, and they might be able to assist us. We understood the importance of thinking the same way, of understanding the world in the same way. And you can only do that with language. If you want to understand how that particular group looks at it. So the idea of monolingualism is in fact a choice. Multilingualism provides us with a better understanding of the world. If that had been allowed in the 1900s, if the boarding schools had allowed multilingualism, so much more could have been accomplished. And the rate as to how fast tribes began to process how to live in this new kind of government, in this new kind of world, would have been expedited beyond anybody's imagination. And actually, among our own tribe, the Cherokees, that history manifested itself. We were, for example, the Cherokees were, for example, the first people to build a post-secondary university level institution west of the Mississippi. We had what was called female and male seminaries in the capital of the Cherokee tribe in Oklahoma, in Ecological, Oklahoma, by 1880. We built the first colleges. It didn't change our culture. It didn't change who we were, and hasn't changed who we are now. From a perspective of of assimilation as opposed to resistance. We became educated in the American way in order to facilitate a better understanding of how to survive in that society. Simply put, they were practicing what our tribe had done for thousands of years in the Southeast. We simply wanted to teach our children how the American system thought and how it worked, so that they can deal with it in an effective way, so that they can retain their own identity and stave off any further kinds of intrusions culturally. And they were effective at it. We had our own laws. We had our own law books. We had all of those kinds of things, and we conducted ourselves in that manner. But as is always a story, that also is taken away. But we proved that it can be done. We proved that multilingualism, the understanding of the world in the best possible way, can work if you allow it to happen, but you cannot force and take away the intrinsic value of that tribe's culture and their language and make any kind of headway at all. And in fact, that tribe will probably disappear as a tribe, and we will become cats who bark. We are trying to avoid this. We are making every effort we can to revive that culture through our language and make it understandable that if we bring that language back, we have absolutely a better chance of surviving in this society. The last note that I want to make is that at one time, the forests of the Appalachians, as I spoke before, and all the way up into the Alleghenies, were once great, majestic forests of chestnut trees everywhere. It was the life nourishment of not only the humans that lived here, but of animals. And because of the nutrients that these plants give, we're also the life, kind of like the life vein of other kinds of plants here. And somewhere along the line, because of blight that was introduced from someplace else, those great forests of chestnut do not exist anymore. There are chestnut trees here, but they're Chinese chestnuts. They were imported. The American chestnut tree has all but disappeared. it's that they are trying to make a comeback, but in a very small way. But it can't replace the great chestnut groves and the great chestnut forests we had here that all life was kind of built around. It's changed here, as is in the background of the as in my background here. Imagine those mountains. I think that William Bartram or one of the other biologists that came through in earlier times noted that something like 3 out of every 10 trees or more in these mountains were chestnuts. That's how many chestnuts that there were. And through logging and through misuse and ignorance of environmental science, these trees no longer exist here. And since they don't exist, a whole ecological system, a whole environmental if you wanted to say a biosphere, has been altered and changed forever and may never be the same again in our lifetimes or in our children's lifetimes. In other words, what we had here just 100 years ago, 200 years ago, we will never see again for the next 1,000 years, even if we begin that process tomorrow. That is, in fact, an example of what happens when a language is lost. The desolation of that kind of knowledge and that kind of wisdom then exists for a long, long time. It doesn't mean that the human race can't, that we as humans can't find out those scientific facts. Maybe we will find out those things that our people knew 400 years ago, 200 years ago. Maybe someday science will find those things out in about 300 years. But isn't it a shame? Isn't it a shame that they might have known those things or learned those things if they would have just listened to what people are saying now? And it wouldn't have been lost, and the effects of that wouldn't have been so devastating. That is the importance of language. That is the importance of not losing a language. To lose a language then directly affects the culture of those people. And as is almost proportionately, one would say, the loss of language equals a loss of culture. And if we are to save what our history and what we mean as a people and what we have learned for thousands of years here, which is hard science, then we're going to have to look at how to keep those languages alive, of how to understand that and to respect that and turn around that 500-year effort to eradicate those languages for the simple cause of based on imperialism and ethnocentrism. That has to stop. And before the language is lost among my own people, and before the language is lost among other tribes, other indigenous tribes in this country, I think that those kinds of efforts have to be made, and we have to relook at those. Saving a language is, in fact, saving a culture. And that's really kind of all I had. I think I might have spoken longer than I was supposed to, but if we have any questions, I mean, I'll do my best to answer them.
Yes, so I was going to say for questions, feel free to put your hand up and we can call on you so we can have an orderly fashion, or if you don't want to speak yourself, feel free to put a question in the chat and I will ask it for you. Dr. Baker?
Thank you so much for just a wonderful, moving, emotional even discussion. I was very intrigued and really thought you're right. You cannot cover this in probably 2 courses, but nevertheless you gave us a hint of it, and at least you outlined the stakes, which I think we all appreciated. And by the way, Zakala Shah is one of my American heroes. I think she's awesome. I've done some research on her, and she's really stuck it to the Carlisle folks in a really sophisticated way. So my question is, I'm just sort of curious, thinking about the mechanisms of white supremacy and almost how efficient they were. Because for African Americans, there was the same move for assimilation a little bit, but those that assimilated well, that had businesses, that spoke properly, that really used language as a tool of trying to empower and improve, they were the ones that were lynched. So if you wanted to survive, you had to speak broken English. You could not succeed because the people that succeeded were kind of systematically taken down. They didn't know their place. And it's almost the converse. And it just sort of amazes me that these mechanisms of imperialism, one size doesn't fit all, and they were actually employed to, destroy cultures efficiently, but almost the inverse mechanisms. And anyway, I just wanted to share that observation and see if you have any response to that.
Okay. As we know, as the Spanish moved in, for example, into Mesoamerica, it's noted that they not only at the same time imposed Spanish as a way of introducing that kind of imperialism, as that kind of colonial, as a tool of that colonialism. They not only did that, but they used other languages of the people who lived there, and there were like thousands, right? Because every town, every area had their own language and stuff. But they focused on languages like Nawa and other things like that, and used them against each other. So they were really efficient at doing that. It didn't necessarily have to be one way. They would do it another kind of way, but the end product was that they would be in control. It was for their purpose. And so they weren't naive, and the Americans were the same way. They weren't naive about what the purpose was, and they would use any kind of means, whichever best fitted it. Because, for example, I'm not an expert or a historian, and when I only know what I've learned and what I've read, and from people that I know. But it always occurs to me that the difference between what happened with the Black population in America at the time of slavery and the Native Americans was that the first thing they did in Africa itself when they brought slaves here was to make them not tribal people anymore. So they came here that way. They came as chained individuals, and they treated them that way. They treated them as an object, as property. With Native Americans, it was very difficult to stop that tribalistic aspect, because they had been doing that. The American system was the newcomer here, and they had to fight against that old structured large tribes that were in fact a tribal people and knew how to govern themselves that way. So they had to attack it that way. And the only way they can do that, the only way they can change that, is to stop that government system, to stop that social system. And the way that you do that is you make them speak English.
That was good. I think that's correct. Thank you.
Yeah. I think that they were very astute at that. Not in a good way, but they were certainly astute at it. Oh, just one more thing to add. Too, you know that the Cherokee tribes were actually doing better in here and in Oklahoma when, in both cases, the government and their land was usurped from them. They actually had better farms. They already had towns. They had taverns. They had inns. They had everything going in the Cherokee country, while most of the population of North Georgia was illiterate.
Do we have any other questions?
I had a question. Yeah. Hi. Thank you so much for giving that talk. I just wanted to ask about the PowerPoint. Would it be possible to go back to the second slide of the PowerPoint?
I can do that. Give me 1 second.
Yeah.
Kathy, can you unpin?
By the way, I only had 5 slides and we only went through 2 of them, or maybe 1 of them.
Yeah. I was just wondering what it meant when you stated that the Cherokee language is a polysynthetic language.
Polysynthetic, is Dr. Fry still with us? I guess not. Dr. Fry, who teaches at Chapel Hill, is an actual linguist. I'm doing this kind of work because I'm a speaker and got corralled into it. But a polysynthetic language is simply a verb-based language. It's a word. Polysynthesism, of course, if you break it down, poly means more than one or multiple, and synthetic means that it can be manipulated. So if you take a word, it means that there are many ways in which to manipulate that one word. That's what makes it polysynthetic. For example, linguists will say, linguists who have worked with the Cherokee language theorize or have said that it's very possible that one Cherokee word that a verb in Cherokee can be conjugated maybe 20,000 times. So if you take a word like dancing, it can be conjugated many, many different kind of ways in order to be real precise about the aspect of that word and how you're trying to present it. I can say that I was dancing. I was dancing. But I can also use another word. That word is galski. And that word means I was dancing, but I don't know for sure. In other words, I must have been dancing. So automatically then all kinds of thoughts shift about just what I've said, you know. It goes from just my act of dancing in the past. Now a person wants to know, okay, what were you doing that you don't know that you were dancing, you know, and stuff. A whole different way of saying, but it's the same word. It's just one sound that switches it. It's manipulated. So that's what polysynthetic means.
Okay.
If you go down to the next, go down to a couple of slides here. Okay, this is an example, they say, and it's at the Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa. This is a handwritten form of what's, this is purportedly written by Sequoyah himself. It's the only known document or writing that is, that people know of, that says that it was, that they say was actually written in his own hand. And if you look, you'll see real calligraphic letters in between the bars, and next to it, what appears to be an English letter or a Roman letter, like the third one, the second one over, that there's a D, and then next to it is this real calligraphic thing. He wrote the calligraphic thing. That was the first example of Cherokee writing. And he wrote this one to say that when he wrote this one, then it was changed over and used for print with the D, and that sound is ah, ah. If you go down to the next slide, and is an example of what the Cherokee Syllabary or our writing system looks now. And you can see lots of borrowed Roman letters, English letters. You see A's and G's and Y's and V and S's and stuff. And this was done to facilitate the printing process. When Sequoyah, when his written form was sanctioned by the tribal council, they wanted to immediately go to print. They wanted newspapers. They wanted all of those kinds of things, but they didn't have the typeset for that kind of writing. So what they did was they substituted English typeset, and in some cases some Roman typeset, or actually kind of Greek typeset for the ones that he was using and stuff, which meant that they could go to print a lot faster. And they began to print. And it was sanctioned in 1820, and the first full translation, literal translation of the New Testament came out in 1826. In 6 years, they'd already changed over the New Testament, and books were being written. So anyway, I wanted to show it, but the thing I really want to show is in the next slide, or maybe the next two slides. Okay, synthetic is a grammatical categories. We talked about that. Polysynthetic means a grammatical story. Okay, let's go back to that last slide. Okay, at the bottom of the page is one word in Cherokee, and it's pronounced Winidotaghenli Skoltanonelidi Sesting. It's one word. And if you were going to write it out, well, you can see how many letters you have to use in English. And in Cherokee, if you wanted to write it out in our syllabary, there would be 17 letters. It's one word. Winidotaghenli Skoltanonelidi Sesting. Now go to the next slide. And that line, that word, that one word means they will by that time have nearly done granting or giving permission from a distance to you and me. That's what that one word says. That's the best example of polysynthetism that I've ever found. You know, all of those phrases, by that time, nearly, permission, you and I, from a distance, and they will in a future tense, are all included in that one word. All of those aspects of that sentence are included in that one word by one or two syllables. It's like playing with Lego blocks, right? You have a bunch of Lego blocks and you can piece them together and make it come out however you want to, or you can take them apart and switch them around, move the front to the back. That's polysynthetism. And that's what our language is like. And it's all designed to make absolutely clear what you're trying to express. By the way, Dr. Fry and I wish he would have stayed on, when Dr. Fry was at Western Carolina University working on his master's degree, we found this word and we were talking about it, and we were saying this word comes from 1826. And Elias Boudinot was saying in a letter from one of his friends who was wanting an example of Cherokee language, wrote back to him that word and explained it to him. And we were trying to say in 1826, there might have been a reason to have a word like that. But how, but why would you use it now, And maybe that's why we didn't know it and nobody else had ever heard it, except it's in this book. It's in this book that was found by Dr. Kilpatrick and his wife, and it's called the New Echota Letters. If you can ever find a copy of it, pages 41 and 42, that word is on there. It's a copy of Elias Boudinot's letter. And we were talking about how maybe we can't even use that word anymore. But if you translate this to, they will have then by that time nearly finished giving permission to you and I from a distance. Where would we use a concept like that? And Dr. Fry himself, I wasn't the one that thought of this. We were sitting, and after a while, he said, you know what? And we were sitting in my office at Western, and he said, what if we were on your computer here and we wanted to buy some kind of an app, you know, from Apple, you know, or you know, from someplace, right? We wanted to buy an app. So we typed it all in, and we sent it in. And in that time period that we're waiting for them to download this app onto your computer or send it to us so we can download it. If somebody came in and said, what are you all doing? Couldn't we kind of use this phrase, you know, like, well, we'll be doing something else when they grant us permission to use this app from a long ways away, you know? So the idea of using that concept is just as applicable, almost. All you have to do is change a couple of sounds, but it's just as applicable in this day and time with computers, with technology, as it was in 1826 with the kind of military stuff that was going on. In other words, reading that word, understanding what it is, and knowing that we haven't used that word in 180 years. Now, we do not use that word. But in the time that we found that, which was a few years back, in the 170 years, 180 years that word didn't exist in our vernacular. So technically it was dead. Just reading it, realizing what that word meant, it still means something. It's like bringing back the dead. It's like taking something out of the cemetery and bringing it back and making it walk again, you know. That's how important that the language is. That's how viable and that's how real the language is. It can still work in any time. And that's why it's so important. I just wanted to add that. And I know I stretched it out, but.
Thank you.
I think that's it for questions. Thank you all for coming. And if you would like to unmute yourself so we can all thank Professor Belt for his fascinating lecture. And thank you for showing up. Yes.
Okay. Before you all go, I want to thank you all for being so kind to ask me to do this, and also for being there to listen to this. I want to thank you all for listening, and I hope in some way that it made sense and it meant something. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.